Welcome to Aldershot, famously known as the home of the British Army. Today a major town located on the eastern edge of the county of Hampshire, Aldershot's association with the British Army, as the home of the military's first permanent training camp, caused it to develop from a small rural village into the highly populated urban centre it is today. We'll take a stroll through Aldershot's town centre in a few moments, but we begin our walk for today on the outskirts of Aldershot, where there stands a very prominent statue of the Duke of Wellington on horseback. Built in the 1840s, weighing over 40 tons and standing over 30 feet high, this statue of the former British Prime Minister and military commander was one of the largest statues ever built in Britain for its time, unveiled in recognition of the Duke of Wellington's key role in the nation's victory over Napoleon, as well as his wider impact as a leading politician of the 19th century. As such a key figure for the time, this statue was unveiled in 1846 not on the outskirts of Aldershot here, but in the heart of the British capital, London, in Hyde Park, where it stood on top of the famous Wellington Arch. The Wellington Arch was built as a kind of Arch of Triumph, which commemorated Britain's victories in the Napoleonic Wars, and for 36 years, this statue of a key player in those victories stood triumphantly atop it. However, in 1882, the Wellington Arch was moved to Hyde Park Corner, where it stands to this day, while it was decided that this huge statue, seen by some as ungainly large for the archway, should be moved elsewhere. And on the suggestion of the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII, it was transferred to the military town of Aldershot here, where it was felt the statue would be highly regarded by the army. Certainly, the Wellington statue remains today one of the most notable landmarks in all of Aldershot, situated about a 15-minute walk away from the heart of the modern town, where you'll also find many other references to the Duke of Wellington and the British Army in general. However, as we make our way down through the forest here away from the Wellington statue, let's take a look at a map of the local region to see exactly where the town of Aldershot is located. As we mentioned, Aldershot lies on the eastern edge of the county of Hampshire, roughly 30 miles southwest of London, and the town today forms a loosely connected single urban area with nearby towns such as Farnham and Farnborough. The space in between Aldershot here and Farnborough is populated primarily by one of the largest military garrisons in Britain today, which includes the church that we can see just above the trees ahead, the Royal Garrison Church, or Red Church, which serves many of the 10,000 people, including as many as 4,000 soldiers, who live in Aldershot's military town. Now, we won't be able to visit the military town today, although the army settlement is the home of the popular Aldershot Military Museum, and a number of other landmarks that are well worth visiting if you're in the area and have a fascination for the history of the British Army. However, having now made our way down from the hill on top of which the statue of the Duke of Wellington stands, it's time for us to head into the predominantly civilian settlement of Aldershot, where we'll take a walk around the town centre, look at its main landmarks, and dive into its riveting history. Welcome then to the centre of Aldershot, where we find ourselves on one of the town's loveliest open spaces, the Prince's Gardens, on which there stand a number of statues and landmarks that serve as the perfect introduction to this town's history. One of the newest and most prominent statues to be found in the Prince's Gardens today is this, the Airborne Soldier, unveiled in 2019 and which stands in recognition of the association between the town of Aldershot and the British Army's Parachute Regiment and Airborne Forces, who were based at Aldershot's military town between 1946 and the year 2000. Notably, the statue of the airborne soldier here is standing on top of a large stone that originated in the Falkland Islands, the stone having been gifted to Aldershot by the Falklands government in honour of the role that the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the Parachute Regiment, or Paras, played in the defence of the Falkland Islands after the Argentine invasion of 1982. 30 years later on, in 2012, this bandstand was erected at the heart of Aldershot's Prince's Gardens, and it's today decked out in some wonderfully colourful decorations that make reference to the sizable Nepalese population that you'll find in Aldershot today, and who we'll talk more about later on in our walk. Across the gardens from the bandstand and the airborne soldier, meanwhile, we find another striking sculpture known as the Charging Horse, which was unveiled in 1994 when the Prince's Gardens were first opened. As you'd expect, the Charging Horse symbolises the link between Aldershot and the British Army's cavalry regiments, as well as the Royal Engineers, a key army corps that has been involved in military engineering and technological development since it was established over 300 years ago in 1716. The Royal Engineers are closely linked with this spot in Aldershot in particular too, as before this was the public space we know today as the Prince's Gardens, this was the place where the very first soldiers arrived in Aldershot all the way back in 1853. Those being a small party of officers and men of the Royal Engineers. Where this public park is today, the Royal Engineers established a yard from which they began surveying the local area as preparations were being made for the creation of the military garrison at Aldershot, which was officially born in 1854, just 1 year after the engineers arrived. Now just outside the Prince's Gardens, we're passing by the Prince's Hall, Aldershot's main theatre that was opened back in 1972, a replacement for the town's old Hippodrome and Theatre Royal, built in the Edwardian and Victorian eras respectively, and both of which were sadly demolished at the turn of the 1960s. Now the Prince's Hall has hosted everything from yearly pantomimes to performances from famous names in the world of music and comedy, who visit Aldershot regularly to entertain the town's civilian and military population. Although historically, Aldershot's military town was home to a number of its own venues just for the soldiers. Speaking of the military town, just outside the Prince's Hall, there stand a pair of Victorian-era stones that have been nicely preserved in the modern day. Originally, these stones were a part of the gateway to the East Cavalry Barracks in the military town, built between 1856 and 1859 in the earliest years of the garrison. As we mentioned, it was from this point in Aldershot that the garrison developed, and it was thanks to the expansion of the military town that the civilian town of Aldershot developed too. The Queen's Hotel here being one of the first landmarks of the modern town of Aldershot, opened in 1857 when the influx of army personnel into the area was causing a dramatic change in local life. In fact, before the Royal Engineers rocked up in 1853, Aldershot here was an especially quiet and unknown village, home to a medieval parish church, a smattering of farmhouses, and a large manor house and countryside palace. Agriculture was the main occupation for the couple of hundred people living in the area for much of its history, although the land in Aldershot was never especially suitable for farming, rather home to poorly arable common land on which livestock grazed but few crops were grown. In 1851, there were just 875 people living in the expansive area of countryside that Aldershot comprised. Yet just 10 years later in 1861, that number had skyrocketed to over 16,000, indicative of just how much the arrival of the army transformed Aldershot. Today, the civilian town of Aldershot is home to over 37,000 people, and of course a wide range of pubs. The Alexandra Hotel here, rather notably taking its name from the town's old Alexandra Theatre, which may have been the site of a rather important performance for one of history's greatest entertainers. The Alexandra, long since demolished today, is claimed to have been the place where none other than Charlie Chaplin made his stage debut, back in 1894 at the grand old age of just 5 years old. Chaplin, the son of a couple of music hall entertainers living in South London, lived in extreme poverty in his early life, and his appearance on stage here in Aldershot was a bit of a one-off during his early childhood, starring for one night only at the Alexandra Theatre as he stood in for his mother Hannah. In fact, it wasn't until he was 9 years old that Chaplin began performing regularly, and by the time he was 15, Chaplin returned to perform in Aldershot as part of a travelling Sherlock Holmes play, one of the first roles that saw him ultimately propelled to worldwide stardom. Now just a short walk around the corner from the site of the old Alexandra Theatre, we find one of the most beautiful buildings in Aldershot's modern town centre, the former Wesleyan Church. Opened in 1875, this church was established by a Methodist reverend aiming to spread the word of his denomination among soldiers stationed at Aldershot, The soaring religious building that we're looking at here having stood just a few yards from the old entrance to the military barracks by the Prince's Gardens. Complete with a striking 100-foot tower that soared above all else in the town at the time, and featuring enough room inside for a congregation of over 1,000 people, the Wesleyan church here was a monumental development in the burgeoning town of Aldershot in the late Victorian era, and it remained in use, catering to both military and civilian worshippers for over 100 years, until it was closed down in 1988. Nowadays, the former church building, which is listed and therefore protected from demolition, is used for a variety of purposes, featuring offices, a gym, and a dentist's inside, although it's certainly most famous for its historical prominence in the town, having once been visible from miles away for those approaching Aldershot. As you'd imagine, it's a little harder to spot the Wesleyan church tower from afar on the outskirts of Aldershot today, with the town having ballooned in size over the last 170 years, as it's come to link up with other towns along the border between the counties of Hampshire and Surrey to form the Aldershot urban area, which is home to a total population of nearly 250,000 people. As we now make our way onto Union Street, Aldershot's main pedestrianised shopping street, the sizable population of the modern town and its wider urban area is of course a result of the rise of the army garrison, which then influenced the development of the town of Farnborough to the north, which famously became a centre of British aviation and technological development in the early 20th century. Meanwhile, Aldershot's proximity to London and direct train links to the capital mean that many residents also commute to the big city for work, although the presence of numerous military facilities in the wider urban area here makes up a major part of focus in the region. Now, Union Street here has for a long time been one of the main thoroughfares in Aldershot's town centre, today lined with your typical high street chain shops, but once the home of a number of the town's most prominent civic buildings, including the old Theatre Royal that we mentioned earlier, and many more impressive Victorian and Edwardian landmarks that symbolise the impressive pace with which the former rural hamlet had grown into a major population settlement. On the streets of Aldershot today, you'll still see a number of those old buildings that have survived over the course of the last century, although a number were also lost to history as Aldershot saw sweeping redevelopment in the 1960s. And 60 years on from that period of redevelopment, Aldershot is again now set to see its town centre transformed, with a number of projects currently underway that aim to regenerate the heart of the town. As we pass by the Wellington Centre, the town's main shopping centre, which of course takes its name from the Duke of Wellington, Aldershot's Union Street here is currently the focus of town centre redevelopment that's set to see the building of a new town square, known as Union Yard, as well as modern shops, new homes and student accommodation blocks too. This new project should hopefully breathe new life into the heart of Aldershot, which in places has been left rather vacant by businesses shutting up shop in recent years. Although as we can see from the market stalls here, and just around the corner, there's still plenty of activity on the town streets even early in the morning as we're walking today. Now, as Aldershot was for centuries and centuries little more than a countryside hamlet, there was never a prominent market of any kind in the area, but today the town is home to a weekly Thursday market selling a variety of goods here on Union Street and on Wellington Street just next door. Market traders from all over the region sell their goods here in Aldershot, a town which today is home to a strikingly diverse profile on account of its association with the British military. While it was in the 19th century that thousands of British soldiers moved into the area to work at the Army's first permanent training camp, in the 21st century, Aldershot has become a bit of a hub of settlement for the Gurkhas, the highly skilled soldiers of Nepal and northeastern India who have fought with Britain for at least 200 years. In all that time, the Gurkhas have become renowned for their bravery and ability in military combat, more than 50,000 having lost their lives fighting for the British Army over the years, while 26 Gurkhas have been awarded with Victoria Crosses over time. Today, there are more than 4,000 Gurkhas serving in the British Army, while there are as many as 6,000 people of Nepalese descent, many of them being Gurkhas, who have come to live in Aldershot in the last couple of decades. Now, for a long time, the Gurkha Brigade of the British Army was based over in Hong Kong, although upon the return of Hong Kong to China in 1997, the brigade's base was moved here to Aldershot. However, while Aldershot gradually became the home of a number of Gurkhas living in the military town, those who had retired from service before the move from Hong Kong in 1997 were legally unable to settle in the UK, something considered by many to have been deeply unfair given their immense sacrifice for the country over the years. Now this effectively remained the case until as recently as 2009, when, after a very prominent campaign led by the actress Joanna Lumley, it was eventually agreed that all Gurkha veterans and their families would be allowed to move to and settle in the UK, and ever since, Aldershot here has become the most notable face of the success of the Gurkha Justice campaign. Nowadays, you'll find many Nepalese businesses on the streets of Aldershot, which is known affectionately by some as Little Kathmandu. And while it's only been 13 years since all Gurkhas gained the ability to settle here, they've certainly become an important part of the town's profile. Here, we find ourselves looking inside Aldershot's historic arcade, a fetching shopping centre built in the 1920s, but which has been mostly vacant for much of its life, now set for demolition as part of the town centre's latest regeneration. But across the town, back on the Prince's Gardens where we started out in the town centre, another statue has been unveiled since this walk was filmed, this one paying tribute to the Gurkhas through a depiction of the soldier Kulbir Thapa, as he carried a wounded British soldier of the Leicestershire Regiment off the battlefield during World War I. Thapa's heroic actions led him to become the very first Gurkha soldier to earn the Victoria Cross, awarded to him in 1915, and the statue that stands in Aldershot over 100 years later is a fantastic reminder of the important role that Gurkhas have played fighting for Britain in conflicts for many years. Here on Victoria Road, there are a number of indicators to the prominent Nepalese population that lives in Aldershot today, from the names of shops to signs written in Nepalese script, as well as some lovely window displays showcasing traditional dress. But while the Gurkhas have become a major part of the local community in the last couple of decades, the town of Aldershot is no stranger to having seen an influx of people in a short period of time, the original establishment of the military town having brought in almost 16,000 people in just 10 years, as we mentioned. By the turn of the 20th century, that number had risen even further to around 25,000 people, and with such a large population, Aldershot was in serious need of all of the facilities befitting a modern town, including the post office here, situated inside this rather lavish building constructed back in 1902, along with a number of private businesses which moved into the area hoping to take advantage of the sizable military population. As we saw with the Wesleyan Church earlier, meanwhile, the larger population also saw the birth of a number of modern religious congregations, this impressive building of 1863 having originally been built as the town's Presbyterian church. All of these facilities and elegant Victorian and Edwardian buildings show us just how quickly Aldershot emerged into a large town from its historic status as a small rural village. But why exactly was Aldershot chosen to become the home of the British Army's very first permanent training camp? Well, although the Napoleonic Wars had long since ended by the time the Royal Engineers arrived in 1853, the British Army was still wary of the situation in continental Europe, and the potential for military offensives by other nations coming from across the English Channel. With that in mind, the army decided that they needed to have a permanent and large concentration of troops in the south of England, and Aldershot, as we mentioned earlier, was home to a vast area of land that was almost entirely unoccupied by civilians or major agriculture. As such, the British Army, by this point engaged in the Crimean War of the 1850s, purchased hundreds of acres of land in the area for the building of the military town, which would rapidly grow to become the home of the army in the UK, and serve as a key military base from then all the way up to the present day. Now, while Aldershot Military Town is today home to around 4,000 soldiers, the camp was once upon a time the largest in the entire country, particularly at the onset of the First World War. Aldershot had already gained great acclaim as a modern centre for the army through the final years of the 19th century, becoming the home of the Aldershot military tattoo, a major military parade, from 1894 onwards. In the 1890s, more barracks were built around the camp as the military town expanded in size, and by 1914, as much as 20% of all of the British Army had come to base themselves either in Aldershot's military town or in one of the many other camps or army facilities in the surrounding area. As such, at the outbreak of the First World War, Aldershot was the main point of mobilisation for professional troops. But perhaps more crucially, as the military town was built for the purpose of being a permanent training camp, it was here that tens of thousands of volunteer soldiers from around the country arrived for their military education at the beginning of the Great War, although the civilian town of Aldershot was somewhat overwhelmed by their arrival, with there having been barely any room to accommodate volunteer soldiers in the local area. Volunteer troops trained in Aldershot soon became a key component of the famous Kitchener's Army during the First World War, and the military facilities here remain some of the most important throughout the conflict, both for training troops and for receiving and treating those returning from the battlefield. In the Second World War, meanwhile, Aldershot was less of a base for training British troops, but rather Canadian soldiers, over 300,000 of whom made their way through this town throughout the war, the largest Commonwealth force to have ever been stationed in the UK at one time. At the end of the war in July 1945, however, the Canadians actually caused a bit of havoc in Aldershot, as having been exhausted from the conflict and understandably anxious to be returned home, they set about 2 days of major rioting that caused considerable damage to buildings around the town, a disturbance so significant that then Prime Minister Winston Churchill even questioned why British troops were not sent into Aldershot to quell the Canadian-induced chaos. The vast majority of Canadian troops were forgiven by the people of Aldershot, however, who were historically a little bit closer linked with the military town just a few minutes' walk from here, although security around the military camp was increased after 1972, when the headquarters of the British Army's 16th Parachute Brigade was targeted by an IRA car bomb in revenge for the Bloody Sunday massacre, the bombing here causing 7 deaths and 19 injuries in the worst IRA attack in Great Britain during the Troubles. Now, having made our way down Victoria Road there and through the history of Aldershot, we find ourselves on the opposite edge of the town centre from where we started, looking at the recreation ground, the home of Aldershot Town FC, the local football club. Aldershot Town, who currently play in the 5th tier of English football, have been based at the recreation ground since 1992, when they replaced the town's old football club, Aldershot FC, who sadly ceased to exist in the early 1990s. Just along from the football ground, meanwhile, is the last landmark on our tour of Aldershot, that being the very colourful Aldershot Buddhist Centre. With the influx of Nepalese people causing this area to become the home of the UK's largest Buddhist community, this Buddhist centre was the very first of its kind in the country, opened in 2015 by the Dalai Lama. Nowadays, the Buddhist centre here is a wonderful addition to Aldershot's town centre, which I hope, after this walk, you'll agree is full of history and far more than first meets the eye, with decades of riveting military heritage having given birth to a captivating and thoroughly unique modern town. That, however, now brings us to the end of our walk around Aldershot for today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're looking forward to visiting Aldershot for yourself sometime soon.